Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm a social studies educator, historian, and host of this, the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I'm also an avid collector of popular culture artifacts. I love what I find at thrift store outlets, garage sale leftovers, and what I spot just making my way around the built world. I enjoy sorting through boxes of free books and magazines, not to mention online collections like Internet Archive, and of course the Library of Congress. But you don't need to spend your time digging through bins or following online rabbit holes to get a look into the past. The movies and TV we watch, the books we read, and the games we play are all documents of the past. So is fashion, food, music, toys, even the roads we travel on and the places we live and work in. Everything is a primary source. This podcast is the result of exhibiting these kinds of artifacts in public, getting passersby to select an item they connect with, and then chatting with me to see what it says about the time, place, and people who made it. The conversation you are about to hear, therefore, is your history, my history, our history, through popular culture. So I'm here with Kevan, who is integral in getting me specifically here at the Mid Hudson Council for the Social Studies Conference in we're in Slate Hill, New York.
Slate Hill, New York. So Miniseries Valley High School.
And this is in Orange County, but not the OC like you know from media. This is a different, but this is the same Orange County from Orange County Choppers, right?
That is correct. We're just about 25 minutes away from Newburgh, New York. So George Washington's headquarters is around here too. But yes, the Orange County Choppers. Guys. Yeah, motorcycle.
Which, if I'm not mistaken, I think they were popular around the same time as what we're about to talk about.
Around that time, I think the show was on Discovery Channel.
Yeah.
And that's where I think it resided for all those years. But Discovery Channel. Orange County Choppers, and we'll segue into...
Cable TV was becoming a pretty interesting patchwork in the early 2000s, wasn't it? It was like...
Yeah, and...
TLC jumped the shark from being like an actual learning channel to just weird stuff,
I think, too, you can relate that to MTV and its roots of being just music and, music videos, but... one of the things that really has attracted me to media and showing in the classroom is HBO's series from, I believe, 2008, John Adams. Something I have used in 7th grade and with 12th graders.
It's the superior of all those kinds of dramas. I've used it in my classroom as well, and the kids, they ask for it because they like it so much. And I'm sure you're like me. One of the things I like so much about it is the camera work. That it's shaky. You feel like you're right there with the characters.
Yeah.
And so the question I have for you is, what ideas or behavior does this convey? Do you think that's part of what they're trying to get across by, instead of having most of the miniseries filmed that third-person perspective? Mm-hmm. Why do you think they put us right into it?
I think they wanted us to, number one, the first thing that pops to my mind is one of the scenes with a young John Quincy with his mother looking over at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And not just John Quincy being young, but also Abigail Adams being vulnerable, scared, nervous, concerned. And I think that was felt, as anyone, amateur historian or a teacher could tell you, that was the feeling amongst especially people around Boston at that time. And I think the camera work, but also just the way that the script was conveyed. Again, the words, and again, the actors. I think I think it's a masterpiece. I really do, because the way it was shot, the acting, the actors and the actresses. Even I'll take a little slight detour, but Laura Linney, who played Abigail Adams, she's been known to do some conferences and talk about her research about what it was like to learn about Abigail and how, again, I'm a social studies teacher. I think she nailed it. I think it was incredible. So I think with how they shot it, the acting, who the actors were, Paul Giamatti is John Adams.
Yeah.
You get that vibe from Paul Giamatti. that John Adams was like a little kind of chihuahua, strong and mighty, but sometimes he was a little overwhelming.
Cantankerous and just.
So I just, they nailed it.
Yeah.
And obviously they probably had, I haven't done this kind of deep research, but I'm sure that the producers and also HBO and their acclaimed success run with so many series, they definitely had some advisors to the writers and to the producers about how to convey those vulnerabilities that colonists felt, concerns that they had, but also how torn they were. That by starting to kind of go this patriotic, kind of anti-English British way was, in a way, personal.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to convey to whoever watches it, and especially to our students in class.
Right. And as using that, perfectly said, but using that as almost a document in itself of the era. That scene you described of them looking over the harbor and seeing, the action in Charlestown with the Battle of Bunker Hill is among my favorite moments in that entire miniseries too. And I feel like, much like all other media in that same era, 9/11 had its influence, right? That they were kind of that vulnerability, that look of confusion, of fear. I mean, the battle's taking place miles away, but she calls after her son who runs to, almost like the people in the surrounding boroughs around New York as that terrorist attack was unfolding. And the images are very similar. Like that raw footage that we've all seen and has made our stomachs turn of watching a plane hit a building. We're so familiar with the skyline of New York in so many different forms and presentations, and then having it marred in such a terrible way. I feel like in that particular scene in John Adams, they were doing a side by side in a way. It was almost like this was their same version of that, and the feelings that they had. Because then, almost as powerful, or on the same level, is the next scene, when all of the casualties are slowly making their way home, and she sees an arm, and she's like, "I know that boy." It is very similar to the way that people were looking for their loved ones and waiting for them. Same era was the Steven Spielberg version of War of the Worlds, which is basically a 9/11 story, right? It uses the same kind of things. So do you think that besides those kind of scenes, by telling the story at all about John Adams, who is like the second fiddle throughout that era in history, he's not George Washington, he identifies himself like that, he's not Thomas Jefferson, he's John Adams, do you think that they were, and I realize it's based on a book by famous historian
David McCullough.
I'm sorry, I always think of that. So it's not like they just said we're going to make a miniseries out of John Adams' life for no reason at all. But by choosing him, then kind of this underdog, this person has to kind of figure out things as they go. Do you think that was reflective of other stuff in the culture of the same era?
I mean, the way I think about John Adams is exactly how you said, underdog and underrated. And I think it's important that, and HBO nailed it, so I guess I'll use what HBO said, is the kind of the tagline for the show. And if my memory serves me, it was John Adams united the states. It was he united the states. He united America. It was something like that. And again, I'm going to go back to what I said, is it showed his vulnerabilities. And he does play second fiddle.
Yeah.
And at times he wanted not to be, but he was finding his way. to figure out how this was all going to work.
Yeah.
And then we see that as president. And I just came back last week from Mount Pilier, where I was very fortunate to be one of 30 teachers who attended a seminar with Dr. Lindsay Shervinsky, and she's amazing and great. And her favorite historian was David McCullough. And John Adams is focused of her second book, not being paid to rep her book, but her first book was about George Washington and the cabinet. No less, now she's the executive director of the Presidential Library for George Washington. But in so many words, what she says is George Washington, again, created so many presidential executive branch precedents.
Yeah.
And John Adams began to learn from those and forge them. And I think that's a key word, is now how I'm going to teach students is forging these precedents that he would think would work.
Yeah.
Because he was figuring it out and being vulnerable to how this thing was going to work. And that's a mark of a great leader. And we see this throughout many points in American history, is great leaders are visionary.
Right.
And I think it's important as social studies teachers to convey that to students, that visionary is to, again, have a plan, but long term, and how that encompasses, and how it's going to encompass this new project.
Yeah.
All Americans.
He was really visionary and revolutionary. He is the revolution, really, because that exchange of power from Washington to Adams, I suppose, maybe more so Adams to Jefferson, is the end of the revolution, because it's saying, so the beginning, and he even addressed what the beginning was. He's like, no, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, that was the product of our revolution, right? The war it came from our revolution. Those ideas were already there. But him becoming the president of the United States ended that era of being able to say, all right, we have a new government. And he's the first to occupy the White House, right? The executive mansion in a new capital city. So it has all those indicators of that major change. This revolution is now nearing completion.
Yeah.
The documentary also comes from another revolutionary era in our history. We tend to have new eras and revolutions all the time as time goes on, and so that it represents that very well. One of my favorite scenes also, I have 10 favorite scenes, but one of my favorite parts later on in the series is when John Trumbull, the painter, presents Adams with the painting of the Declaration of Independence. And John Adams is just so he's like, that's not how it happened. We weren't all standing there proper and submitting this document. It's like people signed it as they went, throughout that summertime. And he's already commenting on that, please don't hold us to be something we aren't. Some of the best primary sources of that time period are the letters between him and his wife.
Yeah.
And gives us insights of what relationships were like back then, what his vision was to be a country builder, not just
a statesman, a
really,
diplomat. And that goes back to what I was mentioning about John Adams forging not just executive branch precedents, but what it means to be a citizen, even though the Constitution didn't clearly define that until the 14th Amendment.
Right.
And that's why I marvel at someone like John Adams, who, again, finally, and should continue to have his moment in historical fields and scholarship, but out in public.
Yeah.
Again, a well-done docu-series by HBO that, again, more teachers, it's possible to use it in 7th grade, which I've done, and it's possible to use it with 12th graders, at least here in the state of New York. Our 12th grade government course is a half-year course that the students have to go through, and I go back to the Revolutionary era, the Declaration, and that it's a birth certificate, and that here's an individual, and here's his role in the formation of it, and again, how he was vulnerable. He changed. He had to think about his family. He had to think about not just his children, but his grandchildren. And I marvel at his story like so many others, and I hope as Americans today again, the students that come into our classrooms, we can convey to them that in the grand scale of things, and I'll tie this in as best I can, we just had one of our presidents turn 100. First one, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, when he turned 100 several weeks ago, was closer to John Quincy Adams' inauguration. And then it was just crazy. So you think that American history is almost 250 years old, but how through someone's eyes like John Quincy Adams and his own diary entries have been documented by the Massachusetts Historical Society, and there are volumes and volumes and volumes of them. And I'm not speaking like an expert. I haven't read them, but I've read excerpts, and it's someone like John Quincy that now I think deserves a docuseries, because he was young, as we mentioned at the top of our chat. He was young with his mother, who's also vulnerable. And he got to see that. He got to see soldiers coming back from the Battle of Bunker Hill, people fleeing the city of Boston. He saw those atrocities. He saw the violence. He saw probably people within his own community change their point of view about their stance on Britain. And John Quincy Adams can be another docuseries, because his life then stretches, as we know, and I'm sure a lot of people listening know. He becomes president, and then he returns to the House of Representatives.
Right.
Who does that? But a man of service. He was a statesman, and he believed in that. But where did he learn that? His father. But he also learned the importance of what it meant to serve and to be educated and treat others with respect and hold yourself to be a gentleman. He learned that from his mother. And I think John Quincy Adams is another, again, hopefully maybe we should send this to HBO and convince them to, again, pick up on John Quincy's story, because students can also learn a lot about what it means to be a citizen by his story and not just his father's.
We've cycled through, as a society, as a pop culture, the founders, right after Adams came Hamilton, right? All the focus on Hamilton through the Lin-Manuel Miranda Broadway show, and he became the star for a while. It seems to have returned back to Franklin. He's the hot topic lately of that. I would hope that at some point or another we kind of break from that era and move on to a figure like Adams. Jackson's brought up a lot, and that was his big political foe, was Jackson. And it would be great to have a John Quincy Adams focal point. There's books written about it, but books don't nearly get the attention from the public as a movie or a miniseries or something like that.
I think because of the ability for people to stream now, I would hope John Adams, the series, again, is, I guess, trending on HBO Max, on their platform. And I think that is just an amazing opportunity to re-engage our citizenry, especially, and then allowing teachers to have the ability to, again, have clips, have actual materials. And I think, again, it's teachers like us who are here doing the hard work, but it would be great to engage other organizations or even HBO themselves, is to actually build that curriculum using those clips, and then getting it into the hands of teachers free of charge, because I'm blessed enough to have a streaming service, Max, and I guess I'll share a little personal story. My wife and I are expecting a son.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you. And we're super excited. As a fan of Thomas Jefferson, we're naming our son Thomas.
Nice.
But also, because of our faith, Thomas being one of the apostles of Jesus. So Thomas, and another personal reason for my wife and I, we've chosen Thomas. We're going back and forth between the middle name, but I can tell you and tell the audience that it looks like John is going to be up there. One of the things that bonded my wife and I early on in our relationship in 2021 was when she started coming over, us dating seriously, was watching the HBO series John Adams.
There it is.
And when we watched it through, one of the first things she said out of her mouth was, "Wow, incredible.
Yeah.
What a life, what a legacy." And then she said, "I'm disappointed. I didn't learn a lot about him when I was in school." And she didn't want to shame her teachers. But as we become to know the news of us expecting a son, instantly, one of the first things we talked about was, I was John. Plus, it's my middle name, and it's also my father's middle name. But I'll tell the audience this too. I pushed for John Quincy. I didn't get far.
Too on the nose.
But maybe maybe it'll, depending upon how the polling goes. We got some time until March comes. But my wife does like Quincy as a middle name, but she really, really loves John. And that series really opened up her eyes, and we've watched it here and there. We watched it once together, but then we'll just watch random episodes. But especially on July 4th, we watched, I believe it's episode 3 is the Declaration episode.
Yeah, I do that every year.
And it moves us.
Yeah.
It moves us, and we make sure to watch it to remind us. And I think, again, whether it just, not just because I'm a history teacher, but my wife is not a history teacher, she began to own that era of the revolution and felt a close connection to someone like John Adams. She knows that I'm going to be going to Boston for the National Social Studies Council, the National Council of Social Studies conference in Boston in late November. And I told her I want to make sure I stop by Quincy, Massachusetts, to go pay my respects to John Adams and John Quincy, who are both in a crypt in a Presbyterian church. And being that my wife and I are Presbyterian, it's even more of a reason. Yeah. But I think we have a real opportunity in using pop culture, in this case, a streaming series, to really engage kids, but also at the same time, because it's adult appropriate, is engage our citizenry about what it meant to sacrifice, be vulnerable, and kind of figure it out. And put together, again, we're an imperfect union until we reach, we know, that perfect union that's stated for us. And I think that inspires me as a teacher to continue to grind, endure, and conquer to make sure that I see through what was bestowed to me. And I make sure that students know Abigail Adams is a huge part of that. And so is John Quincy.
This podcast, what I do is, it's tiny. It's not a huge thing, but the preamble to the Constitution, the first 2 lines is really the focus of it. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, because that's what it's all about. And popular culture, by definition, unites people, right? It united you and your now wife. It's informing your interest in what you're going to name your son. My son's name is John. His first name is.
Right, and
I remember when I was when we settled on that name, I made a list of all the Johns that I admire, and a lot of them are from popular culture, right? John Madden, John Adams was on that list. John Riggins, the whole list of all these, and then family members named John and things like that. And, names, what people name their children, those are indicators as well. And I've noticed, and my wife has too, because we're both in education, you can watch trends of names, and you can tell, what was popular when, but lately, and we're teaching teenagers, I am anyways, so it's 15 years ago, 16 years ago. All right, so it seems like the names are kind of calming down again. They're going back to more traditional sounding names. I do have a few Johns in my classes, which, taken out of context, it sounds bad. But, I have, kids named John. And I'm like, that was not true when I first started teaching 15 years ago. It was a lot of Chandlers and Monicas and Phoebes, and
I love the Friends reference.
Right, that's all it was. It's just every kid was named after. No George Costanzas, but there was mostly Friends references. But I feel like there's, because miniseries in this case, like John Adams, and then Hamilton later on, transcend 200 plus years of time. And what you're describing is, it made them seem like real people.
Yes, real.
Right? And so if you have that kind of connection, then you're much more inspired to bring them into your own life in the form of, in this case, naming your child after somebody.
Yeah, I've had students But my mom and dad were both teachers, and in so many words my parents have both said to me, if you can emotionally move a student or students in any way. My mom pretty much taught K through 8. My dad was pretty much taught every grade. My dad was an art teacher as well as a football coach. And they said to me early on when I decided 9/11 sealed the deal for me wanting to be a teacher, because I saw how my parents were with their students, because they taught in and around the city in New Jersey. If you can move a student, their emotions, to cry, to get up after a lesson and shake your hand or a fist bump, you've done more than your job. You've made a citizen. You've taught them something that can never be measured on a quiz or a test or an essay. And I've had students in the particular, when they're voting, when the delegates to the Continental Congress are voting on the Declaration of Independence. And John Adams, again, theatrical, but he says, while I live, let me have a country.
Yeah.
I've had students cry. I've had students get emotional.
Yeah. That was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And this will be not the last time we talk.
Yes,
We'll
sir.
see each other in Boston, and we'll talk more John Adams.
Yes, sir.
In his hometown. Thanks again.
Anytime.
Popular culture, by definition, connects and unites us, and proves that people of different backgrounds, in fact, have a lot in common with one another. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, at least in part, for that reason. If it connects with you and you'd like to add to it, or any of the podcast episodes, just visit everything-history.com and search for the Everything is a Primary Source project, which can be found in the classroom section of the website. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Be sure to rate and share this podcast wherever you are listening to it now, and follow Everything as a Primary Source on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. Thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.